Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I please have everyone's attention? Before the meeting begins, we ask that everyone please silence your cell phones. The Fort Bend ISD Board of Trustee meeting is an open meeting for the public to observe the board's conducting district business. Therefore, audience members may address the board during their designated audience item section of the agenda. If you have printed material you want to give to the board, you must provide them to board secretary Gary Rozier or me, and we will provide them to the board. We also ask that members of the audience be respectful of others and remain quiet during the meeting so that everyone is able to hear the proceedings. For your convenience, microphones have been provided on each side of the boardroom. Please speak directly into the microphone if you are asked to answer a question or addressing the board during the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The time is 6:02 p.m. and this meeting is hereby called to order. We have the presence of a quorum and the meeting has been duly called and notice of the meeting has been posted for the time and manner required by law. Please rise for the pledges of allegiance and remain standing for a silent invocation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Please remain standing for the silent invocation. You may be seated. Mrs. Tossan, can you hear us just fine?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Great. Board member Mrs. Kristen Tossan is joining us via Skype this evening. So thank you for being here. First on our agenda are our audience items. Mrs. Carrie Waschenfelder, please stand to the nearest mic. You'll have 3 minutes. Mr. Rosenthal will give you a 30-second warning.
Good evening, President Burdine, Board of Trustees, and Dr. Dupree. Without delay, let me thank you on behalf of all the teachers of our 1,900-member union for the pay raise that was passed in the budget for 2019-20. Though many will say we should be thanking the state for that raise, the point remains that the administration and the board pushed for a pay raise for 3 years in a row of 3%, exceeding what was mandated by the state. The message you sent is very important. You are valued. We want you to stay. We need you enough to fight for you to stay here in Fort Bend ISD. That message is terrifically important to anyone's morale. But I'm here to speak about a problem with the morale picture. It's not enough to take care of only 60% of the employees. You have to consider the morale of all your employees. Now it's time for us to ensure that we have enough supports for not just our teachers, but our classified workers as well. We can't ignore our veteran workers who are at the far end of the pay grade, who will get less than the 5% given to new members and new employees. No veteran should get less than the newest employee in their ranks. To pay them less in a percentage of a raise than you pay raw recruits is demoralizing, especially since this raise is part of their TRS calculation for retirement. These seasoned employees bring a luster to our workforce and ensure we reach our lofty goals with their experience, wisdom, and training that comes with years of service. Now let's look at the whole picture of the people that impact our life. Behind me sit representatives from our union that are just an idea of all the people that we represent, who are awesome workers. Our families depend on the bus drivers. We depend on the custodians to keep those chalkboards and now the whiteboards and all the computers working so that our children can actually move forward into that 21st century that we promised all of our taxpayers and that we all want for our children. We thank all of the grounds workers who keep our fields ready for countless games of Red Rover, baseball, tag football, soccer, all of the good, clean fun that we now know is important to the brain development of our children. And we need
30 seconds.
secretaries, and office personnel to watch that each of our children is getting the nurturing educational assist that they need to have and ensure an equal opportunity of education in the United States of America. Please be fair to all of our workers and grant our veterans a full 5% pay raise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Washingfelder. Next are our information items, first being the Gibson Purchasing Payables Follow-Up Audit Update, or Follow-Up Audit, Dr. Dupree, excuse me.
Yes, sir. Mr. Rice, would you like to address the internal audit?
Yes, we have a representative from Gibson Consulting, I believe, who is going to give us an update on the result of the purchasing and accounts payable follow-up audit presentation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rice.
I don't
Sir.
think the mic is on. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Rice.
All right,
And thank you,
you.
trustees of Fort Bend and Dr. Dupree for inviting me here today. My name is Ken Ingram. I'm an internal auditor with Gibson Consulting Group. And before I get started, I just wanted to say that at Gibson, we are very excited and happy to be the internal auditors for Fort Bend. A large part of that is due to Fort Bend's view on internal audit, which is one of continuous improvement. That is something that Gibson also believes. We're not here to catch out management on wrongdoings or point fingers or anything like that. We always approach our work with helping Fort Bend employees get better at what they do and be more effective and efficient. My agenda today will be brief. First, I'm going to start with some introductions of the project team, then provide a background of the follow-up audit. Then I'm going to discuss the follow-up audit results. Greg Gibson, who is the president and founder of Gibson Consulting Group, served as the quality assurance partner on this project. He couldn't be here today, but I believe you all are very familiar with Greg. I mentioned myself, Ken Ingram. I served as the lead auditor on the project. Cheyenne Rolfe, who also couldn't be here today, was the project manager. She also serves as the program manager for Fort Bend. So one thing I wanted to highlight before we dive into the details here, a follow-up audit is substantially different from a full initial audit. Really, we're only looking at the implementation status of the items we recommended in the original audit, in this case, the purchasing and accounts payable audit. We get the implementation status from quarterly updates that management makes on our internal audit tracker. And then we do interviews, data analysis, audit testing to develop our own independent assessment of implementation status. The initial audit for accounts payable and purchasing was completed in January 2015. Our follow-up audit started in December 2018 and then concluded in May 2019. As you can see, there were 5 areas addressed in the initial audit. Each of these areas had recommendations for improvement. So we ended up addressing these areas in the follow-up audit as well. Now I'm going to give you an overview of the follow-up audit results and then look individually at implementations by recommendation. Overall, we found that there was substantial and significant progress made in 3 key areas by the purchasing and accounts payable departments. First, there's an increase in contracting efficiency, reducing the amount of time it took to push through a contract, get it approved, and then authorized. We also saw there was an increasing dollar amount that was paid electronically to vendors. This is a much more efficient and accurate method than cutting hard copy checks. Finally, there was a really robust audit program put in place over purchasing card transactions, making sure those are appropriately approved within budgeted amounts, and that was very positive for me to see. However, there are still some areas that can be improved, and we found one kind of major obstacle in this audit was that we learned a lot of very good changes that were made by management, a lot of strong controls put in place, procedural changes. However, these were not always formalized, and there was a lack of audit evidence that we could see to fully mark off recommendations as being completely implemented. I do want to point out that management has agreed with all of our independent assessments and is actively working to fully implement these recommendations. Overall, we decided that 4 recommendations were completely implemented. 1 recommendation was substantially implemented. 4 were partially implemented. And 2 were not assessed, as management did not agree with these recommendations in the initial audit. The pie chart on the graph does not include the non-assessed recommendations. The next 3 slides include a table that shows the recommendation as it was written in our initial report, management's evaluated implementation status, and our independently evaluated status. I'm going to discuss briefly the recommendations that we decided were not completely implemented. The first recommendation I'm going to talk about is A2. And this was really for management to understand what was causing improper contracts and then implement procedures to reduce or eliminate those. So here, an improper contract is one that's been executed after goods or services have already been provided. And we saw here that there were some really good changes made. There was a contract request form put into place, which really helped speed up the process, which reduced the need to push through a contract, maybe not following the procedure you want it to. However, there was no monitoring part of this by management. There was no way for us to come on the back end and see the number of improper contracts that are still out there. So for that, we couldn't definitively say, yes, this has been completely implemented. We did perform audit testing, which showed that our samples were all appropriate. There were no improper contracts in those, which is why we bumped it up to a substantially complete implementation as opposed to a partially complete or not complete. The next recommendation I'm going to discuss is B2. And this was about monitoring blanket purchase orders. So a blanket purchase order is a purchase order that is open and active for a set amount of time. Could be a year, could be 6 months. And they're really good to use if you know you're going to need a lot of an item, but you don't know when the delivery is going to occur, when it's going to be used. And so one good way these are used at Fort Bend is through air filter replacement services. You know you're going to do a lot of them. So this way it's easier to just invoice against this blanket PO and get the services as opposed to having to open a new purchase order every single time. However, in 2015, we saw a lot of instances where blanket purchase orders were used in instances where a regular purchase order would have been better to use. And so management agreed that this is something they need to keep an eye on and track. Present day, management still said there were some departments that were struggling with this and having issues. There were some changes that were made, such as needing a more descriptive request that says kind of why you need a blanket purchase order. However, there was no real monitoring put into place. We couldn't get a grasp or feel for how many blanket purchase orders were out there. And so we couldn't assess whether or not management steps and additional training they provided were effective in reducing and controlling the amount of blanket purchase orders. The next recommendation is C1. This was really about increasing the timeliness of receipt of assets into PeopleSoft, which is the ERP system here at Fort Bend. And we kind of viewed this in two separate buckets. One at the warehouse level. We walked through the warehouse, had some good interviews, learned really good controls that they were doing, such as comparing items that were on the floor of the warehouse to what had been received in PeopleSoft to try to highlight things that needed to get processed and moving. However, this wasn't formalized. There was no real audit trail, so we really had no basis of knowing if this actually occurred or not outside of anecdotal evidence. And one thing that was struggling at the campuses for receipt was management never really formalized what's expected to be received at the schools versus what's expected to be received centrally. And so there was a little difficulty there if an item came in that campus officials weren't used to, didn't know how to put into the system, that caused a delay. Similarly, vendors would occasionally send items to the school that should have been sent centrally. Accounts payable personnel would have a hard time tracking that down. And so, discussing with management, we decided that they need to formally document what can be received centrally versus what can be received at schools, and then potentially add some language to purchase orders restricting vendors from sending items to schools that need to go to the central office. Because there wasn't a substantial change really in the receiving function at schools that was causing some of these timeliness issues, and that there wasn't audit evidence at the warehouse level, we said this was partially complete. The next recommendation I'm going to discuss is D1. So this was for management to understand what was causing confirming purchase orders and implement control procedures to eliminate them. So a confirming purchase order is a purchase order that gets processed after goods or services have already been provided. A kind of a prime example we saw was a teacher individual buying t-shirts and then putting in the requisition after cash has already been paid and t-shirts have been given. Similar to other things, we found that there were some changes made in controls. A really great one was requiring Leadership Council to review a monthly report of confirming purchase orders, which has increased accountability, put the onus on people to chase up and say, why was this done incorrectly? So that was really good to see. What drove our partially complete decision was we did data analytics to see how many confirming purchase orders were still out there using management's report. And we still found a high percentage. I believe it was around 9% of processed and invoiced purchase orders were found to be confirming. And so that drove us to say there have been some changes. They weren't as effective as we wanted them to be, so that led us to say it was partially complete. Finally, the last recommendation I'm going to discuss is E1. This was centered around implementing a performance measure framework that the accounts payable and purchasing department could use to become more efficient, ensure customer satisfaction, etc. Both departments are informally monitoring performance measures. Again, just kind of the last gap there is firming this up, making it a formal process, identifying all the measures you want to have, allocating responsibility for generating these measures, determining how you're going to use them. These were some of the steps that hadn't occurred yet in both departments. So that led us to say it was partially complete. And I'm happy to address any questions the trustees or Dr. Dupree may have.
Thank you Thank you very much for the presentation. Mr. Rice, did you have a question?
I have some comments that I would like to make, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues for questions. And this is really for the audience's benefit as well. Fort Bend ISD has a robust internal audit program. In 2005, the state legislature imposed a duty on the Board of Trustees to be responsible for all audits conducted. And so we have taken that responsibility very seriously, and each year when the audit committee meets, they decide, along with Dr. Dupree which departments we're going to audit. Some departments are audited annually. For example, we have a financial audit prepared every year that's done by our CPA, and then other departments are audited maybe every 3 to 5 years. But at the end of that audit, once the audit has been completed and presented to the board and accepted, it becomes part of the public domain. And then, but we go further, and then 9 to 12 months following that, we conduct a follow-up audit, which is what this is. And so I want to mention that because it's important to know that we take all of these things very seriously, the administration does, and the Internal Audit Committee. And we have been, for the last 6 years, conducting these audits, which are, in effect, they're efficiency audits. Because over time, the district changes. It has grown, and policies and procedures that we used in the past may become outdated. And that's what these audits prove up, because we bring in individuals from different walks of life who have expertise in the various things, and that's how these audits are performed and provided for us. And I would like Mr. Burdine to reserve the right to come back and make some final comments, not questions, on efficiency audits and the new regulation by the state of Texas regarding them. So I'll turn it over to, I believe Mrs. James had hers up first.
Thank you very much, sir. Mrs. James?
Thank you. Thank you for those comments, Mr. Rice. And I'll just say that having been part of the audit committee in the past, I know we've worked really hard on using our audits as a tool for continuous improvement, but also as a way to assess what we're doing well and what we're doing not so well, and what we can start doing and what we should start doing and what we can stop doing. So you're right, that has a lot to do with efficiency in the organization, and there's fiscal impact to that. So thank you for pointing that out. My question has to do with the all of these recommendations, and maybe this is a question for administration. All of these recommendations that were partially complete, are they being, when is the time that we expect them to be complete, or what's the timeline for implementing these things or finishing this up? I'm not sure who answers that question.
I'll jump in, and Brenda may step in as well. We haven't finalized our time frame for these. We have been working on them. Like there is a bit of the session we could have like on the performance measures per se. I mean, we have some of them have a little bit of a disagreement in terms of if you put 20 measures, and there certainly are 20 measures you could have for purchasing.
Yeah.
But you only want to pay attention to a few, and so we do have KPIs for Brenda's area, and those are the things that we're focusing on. We have those in place now, and so anyway. But as far as the confirming POs, we know that there's more work to do on that. We exchanged some emails with Dr. Dupree in June and earlier this month in terms of what can we do in terms of getting with the vendors. And so hopefully we'll be able to continue to improve on that, over the coming year to get that percentage down, as low as possible.
Yeah, I could see there was improvement on that. So it looks like you're moving in the right direction. So I was just trying to understand, and I don't know Brenda, you're standing there like you're waiting in line to talk. I don't know if you want to comment or not, but I guess I just don't, I don't know what the right pace is. And so I'm just curious. I mean, obviously things that are, there's some balance.
Let me just also say, though, the thing that's really interesting about this audit is that since this was done, Brenda is the third director, and we've had almost a total turnover of all the key staff. We only have one buyer remaining, from 2015, and we've had total turnover. Two new assistant directors. So anyway, that certainly has inhibited our ability to make the kind of progress that we're used to seeing. But Brenda and her team, as you guys have noticed through the things that you've been seeing, things that we've been catching, And I think you've certainly seen improvement on your
Yeah.
end.
And for sure, purchasing is important, and we need to do it right, and we need to, be excellent at it. So I understand. So thank you for sharing that. Brendan, do you have comments?
Okay, I just wanted to add that I've set the goal to have these substantially or complete by June 2020. So I'm trying to give myself a year. I'm working with IT right now to produce the reports that will give us the data so that we can see that those things are progressing.
And that's great, because it sounded like some of it is having the data to look at, to know how you're trending, and then having somebody be watching and get on it quicker rather than
Right.
looking at it a year later and realizing, oh, we didn't do that great. So
Working on those tools to measure it.
thank you. Okay, thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mr. Rosenthal?
Thank you. In looking at some of these items, which one would you say has kind of the greatest risk to the district, at least financially? Have you ranked these, or have we ranked these, or?
I think the one with the potentially greatest risk is the confirming purchase order, because that represents really a breakdown of the standard purchasing process. And that could open the district up to problems if someone buys something from an unapproved vendor, things of that nature, which to management's, benefit, they've also agreed with that, and that's something that they're focusing on. In my opinion, that's the one that has the greatest possible risk.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mr. Rice, did you want to make some comments?
I just want to make a couple follow-up comments because I want to give a shout out again to Mr. Bassett, who during the last legislative session went to Austin many times and fought for Fort Bend ISD to receive the funding that we're really entitled to. Out of 1,100 districts, there are about 16 that, because of their situation, because of their economically disadvantaged numbers and so forth, did not receive as much money as some of our neighbors did. And Mr. Bassett did his level best to make sure that we did get more. And at the same time, he and his staff were working very hard to get our budget finalized and put together, because we had to vote on that in June. And so when you look at the number of days that the board meets in June, there's a lot that goes into it. And the legislature did not pass House Bill 3 until about 5 p.m. on Memorial Day. So, and I've also, it's come to my attention that Mr. Bassett may have been the only school CFO who went to Austin to talk to the state legislature about this, and all the rest of them stayed home and enjoyed Memorial Day. So I just want everybody to know that we work very, very hard to make sure we can give raises to all of our employees. And when we're giving raises, it's important to know where the revenue is going to come from, because if you don't know and you make decisions in an ignorant manner, you wind up in the red. At the same time, we've put together a budget in which we know in the future we may have to go for a tax referendum. And in order to do that, we have to have an efficiency audit. And the state legislative budget board is the one who determines what the efficiency audit consists of, and they haven't done that yet. And they don't have to do that until January of 2020. So in the meantime, every single audit that we have undertaken for the last 6 years is an efficiency audit of that department, every single one. And as I said, we've had a very robust internal audit program during that period of time. And once we know what the state intends to do with the efficiency audit, we may hopefully be able to use some of these mini audits that we have conducted over the years. But I just want everybody to know how hard the district has worked to continue to improve processes and procedures as the district has been growing. And we have done this in a very transparent manner and shared every single audit with the public, and just as we're doing now. So hats off to you again, Mr. Bassett, for your yeoman work during the last legislative session. And Mr. Ingram, thank you very much for being here today. I don't think we have any other questions, and we'll see you next time.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Up next, I did want to make one more comment. I wanted to thank Mr. Rice for leading our audit committee. Appreciate your work. So, that being said, we're going to move on to our gifted and talented program review and task force update. Dr. Dupree.
Yes, sir. We have a broad report this evening because we've invested a great deal of time with the task force over the past year on efforts to improve our gifted and talented programming, and we've also conducted a program evaluation. So we're going to update you on all of that this evening, and I think, Deanna, are you opening that? So I'm going to turn it over to our Chief Academic Officer, Deanna Saavedra.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree, President Burdine, and members of the board. As Dr. Dupree indicated, this evening we're going to be providing you an update on our GT programming along with key findings associated with the program evaluation. Alice Ledford will lead the presentation associated with the program evaluation, followed by Stephanie Williams, who will share specific program updates regarding service fidelity, student assessment, curriculum and instruction, professional learning, and family and community engagement. We'll close the presentation with Lori Westfall, who is our new GT director, and she'll provide next steps in terms of our GT programming. So I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Ledford. Thank you.
Good evening, trustees and Dr. Dupree. Excuse me, technical difficulties. So good evening, trustees and Dr. Dupree. I'm going to provide you with an overview this evening of the GT program evaluation that was completed by Hanover Research. During the presentation, I'm going to review with you findings related to GT identification, perceived challenges of courses by students, choice in assignments and learning topics, student enjoyment of courses, and then Ms. Williams and Dr. Westfall will share with you how the information I provide to you this evening will be used moving forward. So with regard to the program evaluation methodology, Hanover used two methodologies to complete this evaluation. One, they looked at GT survey analytics, and then secondly, they evaluated GT data, which included demographic characteristics and academic performance of GT and non-GT students in second grade. The survey was completed by 7,326 GT and non-GT students in grades 3, 6, and 11. In terms of overall findings, with regard to GT identification, Hanover validated for us that certain groups in Fort Bend ISD are under-identified. And then later in our presentation today, you'll learn from Ms. Williams and Dr. Westfall how it is that we are going to address this concern. Regarding perceived challenges of courses between GT and non-GT students, the program evaluation revealed that GT students were less likely than their non-GT student peers to indicate that a course was too challenging. This was the case with all classes except for math, in which GT students were slightly more likely than non-GT students to indicate the pace of math was too fast. With regard to choice in assignments and learning topics, this was an area of note in the program evaluation as well. And Hanover, again, validated that currently for us, our student choice is limited. And Dr. Westfall is going to speak with us on how the district will be addressing choice moving forward. The program evaluation also revealed that course enjoyment was not really significantly different between our GT students and our non-GT students. So in summary, with regard to our program evaluation conducted by Hanover Research, they validated for us the concerns from the district perspective and has helped us by informing our next steps. And with this, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Ms. Williams.
So good evening. As Dr. Ledford shared, the Hanover program evaluation provided information specifically around the identification of GT students, needs related to that, and then instructionally around challenge, choice, and enjoyment of our GT students. So I'm going to give you background now on the work that's been done, and I'll hope to make some connections among the program evaluation, our initial steps, and the next steps that we have for 1920. So beginning in 2017-18, we launched a GT task force, and I want to take this opportunity to recognize members of the task force who are here with us this evening on the work that they've done around the planning framework and recommendations. At this time, would you please stand, the GT task force? Thanks for being here tonight. As the GT task force engaged in learning, they identified best practices that would be part of our plan, which would represent goals. And then during the 18-19 school year, the task force created task maps to detail actions for each of the next 5 years in order to meet those goals. Related to implementation, it was important that those goals align with the Texas State Gifted and Talented Plan. And on the next slide, I'll share with you the components. So the Texas State GT Plan outlines components that are part of an effective gifted and talented program for students. They are service fidelity, student assessment, particularly related to identification, curriculum and instruction supports, teacher professional learning, and family and community involvement. The next series of slides detail the initial actions that have been taken by the GT team in order to address each of these components. Related to service fidelity, last year we adopted EHBB Local, which outlined changes in our gifted and talented program, and the regulations for this policy have been developed and are being implemented in the 1920 school year. Part of those regulations define gifted and talented learning plans for each individual student, which will also launch in the 1920 school year. In order to support the identified curriculum and program changes, we've made an adjustment to gifted and talented staffing, which includes the addition of Dr. Westfall, our gifted and talented director, and also the addition of a coordinator of curriculum integration to help with the enrichment experiences. Related to student assessment, as Dr. Ledford shared in the program evaluation, we have some work to do around identification specifically of underrepresented students. Last year, we administered in second grade to all students the COGAT in order to begin that pathway. This year, we are defining local norms, which are better described as criteria that can be used to increase the identification of gifted and talented students in those underrepresented areas. Related to curriculum and instruction, the Texas Performance Standards Project provides projects that are cross-curricular that can be used to address challenge, choice, and student engagement of gifted and talented students. In the spring, in collaboration with the Teaching and Learning Division, those projects were aligned at grade levels because they come in grade bands like K2. During the summer, we've been integrating those projects into the curriculum workbooks, and they're ready for, they'll be the first phase of curriculum enrichment that our teachers have in order to support gifted and talented learners. We also made changes to professional learning in order to address and equip our teachers. As you know, all teachers participate in 14 hours of required professional learning, and teachers of gifted and talented students also do 6 hours of a GT update. This year, we required 3 of those hours be in district because we wanted to outline the new structure of GT programming and provide messaging related to the GT learning plans and the TPSP projects that are being integrated into the curriculum. In addition, because we know choice is important for our gifted and talented teachers, we hosted the Houston Co-op. There were 600 teachers, 350 of which were Fort Bend, for them to be able to get their other 3 hours of the update where they had like a conference style and could choose according to alignment with the components that we've identified. Finally, related to the family and community involvement, I've already mentioned the work of the GT Task Force and that partnership that's been established in order to have an ongoing feedback loop to support the implementation of the task maps and the goals. But I also want to recognize the GT Parent Advisory Committee, which was launched in January and now has an executive board and will continue to be partnering with our team as we move forward. If there are members of that Parent Advisory Committee, could you please stand? And finally, related to family and community involvement, I want to highlight one of the first actions that the GT PAC took which was to host our first annual parent symposium. And the beauty of a parent symposium is that it's hosted by parents for parents, and so they're hearing from other parents who have students in similar need, and they're able to learn from each other. At this time, I want to, maybe this is your first introduction to Dr. Westfall, and I want to allow her to outline the work that will go forward in 1920 in order to achieve the goals that have been set.
As Ms. Williams has said, yes, this is probably my first formal introduction, although you've seen me on paper before now, I'm sure. And when we start looking at where we're going to be going for the 2019-20 school year, one of the first things we needed to kind of analyze is how we got to where we are now. And this is kind of our planning the work. We do have in place, as of May, a five-year task map that was designed by our task force. This outlines the steps that they actually went through. During the 2017-2018 school year, they worked on what we referred to as a GT framework. It was related to, at that time, the state plan in draft form. The draft has now become formal as of, I should know the date, as of July. It has now become formal. So our GT framework is what the task force began with. They looked at that and said, what really should be our key priorities as we go forward into our 5 years? And they identified key tasks that they really wanted us to begin working on. Once those key tasks were developed, they didn't just stay within the task force. They actually went back to all of their constituents, if you will, and asked for feedback. Do you believe that the direction that we're going and what our priorities might be, do you believe this reflects it? Based on that, the 5-year task maps were developed. Those were formalized and accepted, if you will, through our task force in May. So, in looking at our 2019-2020 goals, this is just, by the way, reflecting the first step in our process of in our first step, excuse me, in a 5-year process. So what you are seeing, what the Gifted and Talented Department will do, plans to do for next school year. We plan to launch and support the GT learning plans. You've heard about that, and we've had our training during the summer. So our teachers are ready to do that for the fall. We plan to establish our Champions of Gifted on each campus. That was a stipend position that was approved recently by the board. That will be put into place and established. We plan to institute local norms, maintain our second grade COGAT testing, as that's going to lead to equity when we look at our identification process, the integration of Texas Performance Standards Project in the Fort Bend ISD curriculum. We've began that process. We need to continue so that we know that it's being implemented in the classroom. We're going to pilot power hours to enhance student enrichment opportunities, investigate and design our secondary GT curriculum, which is one of our needs, and then we plan to distribute monthly newsletters and promote monthly parent series in order to address our parent engagement. Now, I know that these are just the first steps that we're looking for in a 5-year plan, but everything is going to start with just one step moving forward to our ultimate goal, which would be alignment with the Texas State Plan in all areas that we've outlined today. And it's really exciting. This is not part of the script. I'm deviating. It is really exciting to be part of a program that is going in the direction of true alignment. And from my personal perspective, I'm looking forward to that because it really will directly meet the needs of our gifted children. And that's my whole reason for being in this particular position. Are there any questions?
Mrs. James?
Thank you very much for that presentation, and thank you for all the documentation you provided ahead of time and all the data, and all that is very interesting. I have a question, if you could clarify for us the term you're using, local norms. And this is near and dear to our heart, or my heart, because we've, in this boardroom, talked many times about identification issues and how we're not identifying children equitably. I'll put it that way. So if you could explain local norms, that sounds like what we're doing in order to address that, and I'd like to know more about it.
Certainly. The local norms that we are looking to implement actually come from the Hanover Research Report that was done as well in February, where they went through and looked at where our children are scoring at the various different levels of socioeconomic, our different socioeconomic levels, throughout the district. Based on this information, they have made a recommendation for numbers that we should look for to identify 5%, the top 5% in each of our low SES schools.
So that's going to be based strictly then on the COGAT in second grade?
It will be based, and what will happen is the COGAT is what we use as our initial screener. There's more as part of our identification process, but it's almost like opening the door. And if a child doesn't have a certain score, then the door isn't necessarily automatically opened. By looking at our top 5%, that opens the door to more children. It really will help address the opportunity for equity.
And where does the piece in the past, there's been a history of teacher recommendations or parent recommendations and things like that. So will that still be part of the identification at these higher socioeconomically disadvantaged campuses?
Absolutely. The goal of these local norms is really to just open us up to more students, more children. There's various different reasons why a parent or teacher may not see what they perceive as gifted that we see on a test. So by testing across the board in second grade, it offers a lot more opportunity. We might see more of those children that maybe the teachers aren't seeing or maybe the parents aren't realizing.
Right, or something might show up in that test. So it's a little bit kind of how we're using the, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a little bit like how we're using the PSAT to identify AP potential in our 8th and 9th graders.
Absolutely.
Okay. So then I also believe I read a little bit, and I know we've also discussed in this boardroom about identifying in different areas besides the academic core subjects. We talked about identification in leadership or in creative arts, fine arts areas. So how does that fit into this? I didn't I didn't hear it if you said it in the presentation.
I did not say it in the presentation. However, as I had mentioned, we have our 5-year task map that directly aligns with the Texas State Plan. Both of those, and I hate to say it this way, but both of those are coming. We're doing a phase-in type of process. So we're looking at actually adding, as we did mention, we're looking at adding the enrichment piece as being our top priority for the 2019-2020, as well as our Genius Hour, that type of a piece. Following that, you'll hear us talking about adding some of the other identification processes.
Okay, that's great. I'll look forward to that. And then I guess my other question, and I saw in the plan that you had written lots of goals and very complicated task maps, and some of it was very granular, and I tried to stay at 30,000 feet where my job is. But I was looking for something that was kind of milestones. You know, what are those milestones that are out there, and is there certain percentages we're looking for? Are we doing this, you know, what's the timeline related? Do we have any information, is there any information in this report or that you have available that the board could sort of know what to expect?
At the point where we are now, looking at May, and I'm not necessarily, anyway, looking at May is when the document that you're seeing has been designed. One of our top priorities also, and you're right, it was not in our next steps, just because our next steps kind of focused on community and it focused on the state plan. But one of our other next step pieces for us personally within the department is to do exactly what you're asking. Just because we need to know if we've actually met the criteria. We need to know if we've met the milestone. And it's more than just a checkbox for us. Our department's incredibly passionate about making sure that what we're doing is the quality. So we are working on doing that. And I'm reading my notes here. I'm probably not supposed to say that. We are going to provide that.
Smart, though. Smart to stay on the
right?
script.
But no, that's one of my top priorities over the summer is making these a little bit more measurable. What can we see for that? So that will be something that we will provide in the future.
Well, the board really likes things that are measurable because then we can see what impact.
Check it off.
Yeah, but again, it's not so much also about checking it off because it's an environment of continuous improvement. So we're always looking for getting better, and really what it boils down to is serving the children. And I feel strongly that we are not identifying some children and that children's needs are not being met. And so I'm anxious for us to seek those kids out and to help them and help their families, because I can tell you just in my own narrow experience, you know, in 1 or 2 feeder patterns in this district of children whose needs were not being met, whether they were identified gifted and talented or they refused to be tested and so they were not identified or whatever it might be. And, you know, some of those kids dropped out of high school. So the situation, I'm just expressing, the situation is urgent because every year that passes, we have a new crop of kids that comes through, and we need to find those kids and we need to help them and get them the services that they need. So thanks for working on it.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Mrs. James. Mr. Rice?
Yes, I was just going to ask if we're going to continue the gifted and talented parent advisory input. Is that going to continue throughout the year?
Yes, in fact, well, we have our GT task force. They're the ones who worked on our 5-year plan. They will be working with us as well, at least the next school year, if not more than that, just because they understand the 5-year plans incredibly well. So they will provide good feedback for us as we start working on our milestones and what that might look like. The GT pack itself has just been developed. We have our bylaws, we have our executive board. That's hopefully going to be around for much longer. Just because those are going to be some of our key people when we look at our family and community involvement.
So when you say much longer, it should be,
I'm sorry.
it should be around as long as we have the G&T long-term.
Long-term,
Yes.
and they'll be meeting monthly.
All right,
Yes,
all
sir.
right.
It's a permanent fixture for our department.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Rosenthal?
So to follow up on that, will either of those committees ever get to discuss their work directly with the board? Because I think that would be interesting to hear from time to time.
That's certainly something that we could entertain.
And so, I like the idea of those committees because they're on the ground, and I think they'd be the first ones to know what's working and what's not. And I think that's why that would be important for us to hear that feedback, whether either directly in this room or via some kind of report or something. So my biggest concern with implementing this, obviously it needs to be implemented, is making it as easy as possible for our teachers. Because from my big 1-year experience, you know, I had a couple classes with GT kids, and that was tough, trying to create things that were different, that were, you know, trying to give them choices. We tried, it wasn't always doable, but to me, that's where we really need to have a lot of support, because they're the ones in there, and, you know, it's already a tough job, and now we're having to make sure that they do the right thing, and so they need the help. They need that support. And so, you know, you had mentioned that, you know, we have, where was it? A coordinator, Champions of Gifted Services. So are they at each campus? They are.
Each campus did
Okay.
identify.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mrs. Tossan, did you have any questions or comments?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Burdine. I want to start by agreeing with Mr. Rosenthal and reminding everyone that we have talked in the past about using Schoology for modifications and suggestions of assignments for our special education kids as well as our kids who are identified gifted and talented. So I just wanted to remind us that we've had these conversations in the past. I agree with Mr. Rosenthal. We need to do all we can to support our teachers in this effort. And now that we have the Schoology platform, I think we have a really good way to do that by posting, whether it's videos or suggestions or suggested ways to modify work for kids who are identified gifted. So I just wanted to throw that out there at the outset. I also agree with Mr. Rosenthal. I want to thank the administration for continuing the task force. I think it's something that the board thought was important, and for also creating the Parent Advisory Council. Having been at the beginning of the Special Education Parent Advisory Committee, I think it's going to be really important for us to, I agree with Mr. Rosenthal, I think we need to hear from them. As a board member, I want to hear from the GT Parent Advisory Committee. I want to hear from the Special Ed Parent Advisory Committee members. I think I've seen the Special Education Advisory Committee evolve to where they are used more effectively. I think we need to make sure that we're utilizing these committees in a meaningful way. And the only way we can do that is if we get input from them for what should be on agendas or what should be discussed or what they think is critical or is a priority. So I just would like for us as a district to keep that in mind. As I've seen the Special Education Committee evolve, you know, they've now got some officers elected, and the parents who are really involved are bringing things to the district. And I think that that's a meaningful way to use these committees. And as a board member, I would like to hear from them. So I'm going to second that, Mr. Rosenthal. I also want to say, you know, I'm a parent of a child who's in special education and a parent of a child who's identified gifted. So I just want to remind us that, you know, I read the evaluation. Not all gifted students are overachievers. And I just want to, every time we talk about GT, I remind us of this, that some kids are gifted and do not do well in a classroom setting. And I think that's part of why we're seeing the kids come back and say math is really challenging. They're using a lot of worksheets in the math classes. There's not a lot of creativity. And by and large, our gifted students are creative thinkers. I've got one in my house. Ironically, she didn't test gifted in the subject where she really is most gifted because we, like Mrs. James said, we just stopped testing. So I just want us to remember that when we talk about gifted students, we're talking about the way kids process and think and learn. And I know you guys know that, but I don't want us to always think gifted students we're going to see them as overachievers in the classroom. We have a lot of gifted students who, when we get to the middle and high school areas, they're taking the pre-AP classes and the AP classes because that's really all that's offered to them as an identified gifted student. And that doesn't mean that they're going to be overachievers in those classrooms. If we're not meeting their needs and accommodating and modifying for them in ways that are meaningful and that meet them in the way that they process, then we're going to be spinning our wheels for nothing. So I just wanted to say that again because I do try to remind us every time that it's they're not always, you know, overachievers, and GT kids don't always test well either. So I'm glad that we have the task force and the parents, and I think it's going to be important that we not only listen to our parents, but that we listen to our teachers who are telling us this kid thinks differently or processes differently or thinks outside of the box. And then I'll go back to what Mrs. James said. I want to agree with her that I think our goals have to be measurable. I don't know how we as a board, as a governing body, can know if we're progressing if we don't have things in front of us that are measurable. So I just want to reiterate that. I mean, GT's been placed on the back burner really for too long, and it's time that we start seriously making progress for our kids. So I would like to see measures in place and see some milestones when we plan to be reaching those goals as well. I'd also like to agree with her on the fine arts creative piece of it because, you know, sometimes our gifted kids, it's not math, science, social studies, they're creative thinkers, as we know. I personally have thought quite a bit about our kids who are creative and who go the fine arts route, and they're taking those fine arts courses, but we're not giving them credit for them like we are the AP and pre-AP courses. I have a real problem with that. I have a real problem with that as a board member. I have a real problem with that as a mom. You know, I have one right now who's taking 3 fine arts classes, and it's because that's where she is gifted. So I think we need to maybe rethink the